want to start this story off by saying, rest in peace, Grandmom, and I do love you. 5 years ago, my parents had dropped me off at my grandmom's house. She was old, but still very mobile, and her mind was sharp as ever. In fact, even before she passed away, she never showed signs of memory loss or fatigue. Well, she lived up in a small town in the suburbs of New Jersey. She lived alone, as my grandfather had passed away almost a decade ago. That was one of the main reasons my parents wanted me to spend some time with her, because they feared she was lonely. I love my grandmom, and I had no issues with going to her house and spending the weekend together. When I got there, she greeted me with hugs, kisses, and homemade Italian pasta. It was her best dish. Honestly, the entire weekend was completely normal and even fun. That was until the last night. The night before I was to be picked up in the morning by my parents, I had awoken suddenly in the middle of the night. I was extremely dehydrated and needed water. I reached for my nightstand and saw that my glass of water was empty and needed to be refilled. I looked at my cell phone, and the time was 2:15 in the morning. Not wanting to wake my grandmom, who was asleep in the bedroom next to mine, I quietly exited the guest bedroom and headed for the stairs. I took 2 steps down the stairs and stopped dead. From the stairs, you could see down into the living room. What I was expecting to see was just a dark room with nothing going on, but instead, I saw 10 people standing in a circle. I almost screamed out loud due to these unexpected people. I was about to turn around and go get my grandmom and tell her people had broken into the house when I saw my grandmom. She was standing in the middle of the 10 people. As I studied the bizarre scene below me, I noticed that they were all humming in unison. And that's when I noticed what they were all wearing. They each had on these dark robes with their hoods up. It was like some kind of cultish nightmare. That's when my grandmom started passing around this jar that was filled with some kind of red liquid. Each person took the jar and then took a long sip from it. When they had finished this, they then began saying some sort of chant or prayer, but it was in some language that I never heard of before. And at this point, I was scared out of my mind. I was old enough at that age to know that this was definitely some kind of cult experience. I slowly started to turn around and head back up to my bedroom when my footsteps made a loud creaking noise. I froze in terrifying silence. The 10 people and my grandma below thankfully didn't seem to notice or hear this noise, and I quickly and quietly ran back into the guest bedroom. And if you're wondering if I got any sleep that night, I did not. When morning finally came, I had my bags packed and I was downstairs waiting for my parents to come and get me. When they finally got there, I threw my bags into the car and waited for my parents to say goodbye to my grandmom. She came out to the car and gave me one final hug, but as she pulled away, she whispered into my ear, "The stairs creak loudly at night, my dear." She gave me this big smile, but in her eyes, I saw that she knew what I had seen last night. Utterly perplexed, I didn't say a word the entire way home. In fact, to this day, I've never mentioned to my parents, or to anyone for that matter, what I had witnessed that night at my grandmom's house. She passed away shortly after that happened, and I never got closure on what exactly she was doing that night. However, at the funeral, there were some people who attended whom I did not recognize. I have a feeling some of them were the people that I had seen that night, drinking the red liquid. I like to think of my grandmom as this sweet, innocent angel, but I'm afraid that she may have been involved with things that might have been demonic. Wherever she is, I hope she's at peace. A few years ago, I was out visiting my grandpop, who lived in a tiny farm out in Louisiana. He was someone who didn't believe in buying food from stores, and everything he ate and drank was literally farmed on his land. He was a hard worker, and I always respected his strength and persistence to live independently of anyone else. Well, it was me, my mom, dad, and my little brother. Twice a year, we would go up to his farm and spend a few weeks together. My grandfather lived alone. He had been divorced for a while now, and he never remarried. On my grandfather's farm, there was this shed. He told me never to go into the shed because that was where he would slaughter and kill the animals for meat, and that it was very dangerous to go into. This was the only thing I didn't agree with when it came to my grandpop. I could never fathom how he was okay with killing an animal and then gutting it. One day, while we were still visiting, my little brother and I were out in the field throwing a football around. My little brother overthrew the football, and it landed directly at the door of the shed. I ran over to go get it, and for some reason, I had this uncontrollable sensation to open the shed door and see what was inside. I looked to see if the coast was clear. It was. My parents and grandpa were in the house, sitting at the table talking. I beckoned my little brother to come over to the shed and check it out with me. He was a bit nervous, knowing that we weren't allowed to go in there, but I told him I'm his older brother and that I keep him safe. Once he was convinced, we opened the door. It was very dark inside, but there was no animals, tables, or nothing in it. In fact, there was nothing in there but hay. Confused, because we had thought this was where hundreds of animals had been slaughtered, we walked around the tiny shed to investigate. I was about to say let's get out of here when my little brother told me to come over and check something out. He was standing in the far corner of the shed, kneeling down by this big pile of hay. I approached him and asked him what he found. He pushed aside some hay, and underneath it was a pile of driver's license. We each grabbed a few and then looked them over. They were all driver's licenses of women whom we did not recognize. Honestly, I was a bit unsettled at finding this. Like, why did my grandpa have all these IDs hidden under hay in the shed that was meant for his animals to be slaughtered? Something was telling me to put them back and get out of the shed ASAP. We put the IDs back exactly as we had found them and made our way out of the shed. I still had this unnerved feeling and told my little brother not to say a word about what we had found. That same night, I remember waking up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. As I was finishing up my business, I just so happened to look outside the window. I noticed someone was walking across the farm field and towards the shed. I instantly recognized it to be my grandfather. I watched from the window as he opened up the shed door and went inside. But for the briefest moment, I could have sworn that he turned around and looked in my direction. I sprinted back to my bedroom and tried my hardest to fall asleep. The rest of the visit was pretty normal, and me and my brother didn't go anywhere near the shed. My grandfather has since passed away, and when we went back to his farm to empty out his belongings, I didn't find any driver's license in the shed. I hate to say this, but I wish I had remembered or kept some of the IDs, because I have a feeling if I was to Google their names, I might find something about them that I don't want to know. Me and my little brother have sworn to each other to keep what we found in the shed an absolute secret. I just pray to God that the IDs were something my grandfather had accidentally found, and not something more sinister. Back in 2019, my grandmother was diagnosed with a very rare form of breast cancer. It took our family by surprise because she was always a very healthy person. Because the cancer was so bad and spreading quickly, she was placed in a hospital where she would be receiving chemotherapy and other treatments. Well, on the weekends, that's when I would go up to the hospital and visit with her. Sometimes I would go with my parents and siblings, and other times I would go by myself, because the thought of her just being alone with doctors and nurses in a hospital pained my heart. One weekend, I went to go visit her by myself. She had had a pretty tough week, and I noticed that she had lost almost 20 pounds. It was around 10 p.m. at night, and I was reading my grandmother some chapters from the Bible, because that soothed her, and she was a devout Catholic. Maybe an hour into reading from John's Gospel, I noticed that my grandmother had fallen asleep in her hospital bed. I myself was getting very sleepy, and actually dozed off in the chair that I was sitting in. I woke up shortly after that in a startle. I looked at my watch and noticed that it was after midnight. Thankfully, the hospital that we were at allowed visitation at any time. I was about to go pack up my things and go when I noticed that my grandmother was not in her bed. I got up and knocked on the bathroom door that was in her room to see if she was in there. I knocked, but there was no response. I started to get a bit worried because it was a very small room and there was only so many places that she could have been in. I was about to go ring one of the nurses when I heard this laughter coming from somewhere in the room. The laughter was high-pitched, but I instantly recognized it to be the sound of my grandmother. Confused, I simply called out for her, wondering where the hell she could be in the room. I heard the laughter again, this time louder and even more high-pitched. That's when I noticed it was coming from by her bed. I walked over to it. Her sheets were all raggedy, as if she had just been lying in them, but her bed was empty. That's when I looked behind the bed, where there was a small gap between the wall. I let out this blood-curdling scream as I saw my grandmother crouched behind this small gap behind the bed, kneeling down, laughing like a schoolgirl and completely naked. I felt a mixture of fear and revulsion. My grandmother looked up at me, and I noticed that there was blood on her lips. I saw there were deep bite marks on her forearms and hands, and noticed that she'd been biting herself. I ran down the hall to the nurse's station and demanded help immediately. After the doctors and nurses sedated her and got the situation under control, they asked for me to leave so they could monitor her more closely. A few days after that happened, we got some vague answers from the doctors that the chemotherapy had messed her brain up, and that was the reason she ended up naked and biting herself. I'm not a doctor, and I don't pretend to know about medicine, but I feel like chemotherapy shouldn't cause someone to do that. My grandmother, by the grace of God, is still alive to this day, and her cancer is in remission. However, when I spoke to her about that night at the hospital, my grandmother has zero recollection. Even though she is okay and well right now, that was one of the most terrifying experiences that I've ever had in my life.